Do you suffer from anxiety and stress? Do you often find yourself unable to stay still? Do you experience brain fog and an inability to stay focused? If you do, I might have an answer for the reason why you may experience these things: social media.
When we first get on social media, the amount of dopamine that's released we think is quite substantial. The thing about cell phones is when you first get on there, it can actually be quite stimulating. You get a lot of dopamine. Oh, there's this. Oh, there's that. But very quickly, when you're scrolling on social media, you're no longer getting the novelty, but you're continuing to do it and you almost don't know why you're doing it.
People spend 11 hours a day engaging with digital media, 11, and that's the average, right? We're not forced to be like, okay, what am I doing with my time? Is there something better I could be doing? We just pull out our phone. And you see this, right? Anytime people have one moment of solitude or inactivity, it's like, oh, might as well just check my phone.
At that point, it shifts over to something that's a bit more like an obsessive compulsive behavior, where we can define an obsessive compulsive behavior where the obsession leads to a compulsion. So the obsession is a thought, the compulsion is a behavior, but the acting out of the compulsion merely serves to increase the obsession.
We're all aware that there's this immense gravity that comes from the digital world. It's immense. It's just constantly pulling you in with new content and new distraction. It's probably not the best way to live, but it's so hard to break the addiction.
Although we don't have the exact statistics, almost 54% of the world's population is currently on social media. Now, some people who use social media don't report any adverse effects, while others, they suffer mentally from it. Fortunately, today, I'm going to expose what social media does to your mind and also cover ways that you can protect yourself. One of the most prevalent ways how social media affects your brain is through information overload. When you open pretty much any social media platform, you're bombarded with pictures and videos, different captions, ads, likes, comments, pop-ups, and so on. This gets way worse if you begin scrolling down or you get stuck in a cycle of watching endless short videos. Your brain has to constantly keep up with dozens of different media types flying into your cognition. But it's not just the media types, it's the content itself. For instance, I love the topic of SEO. And if I open up Twitter right now, I'll be bombarded by different strategies and tips and tactics and reports around SEO, which in some ways is nice because I get to learn and develop. But it's like overwhelming. All of a sudden, within 30 minutes of being on Twitter, I have 40 different strategies I can use to improve my SEO. And it's way too much. Whereas really what I need is just one, and then implement it and then get the result. And from there, I can go to the next one. But if I open up Twitter, boom, 40 strategies within 30 minutes. And that then leads me to feeling stuck because I don't really know where to start. And this often leads us to feeling tired. We're just overloaded with information that we have consumed. So when we're mindlessly consuming social media for hours and overclocking our brains with information, that leads us to feeling anxious, stressed, have brain fog, and it's way more difficult to do anything else afterwards. Why? Because we use up a lot of our dopamine reserves from our baseline levels of dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical in our brains responsible for motivation and reward, and our baseline levels of dopamine are the amount of dopamine we have in our system. When we engage in something with high amounts of stimulation, like scrolling through Instagram reels, we are spending dopamine from our baseline and gaining peaks of dopamine because it feels good to see different content. But over time, the reserves of dopamine begin running low and we become bored and anxious.
Now, nowadays, there's a ton of interest in social media. Social media is an interesting one because the amount of dopamine that's released in response to logging onto social media initially could be quite high, but it seems likely that there's a taper in the amount of dopamine, and yet people still get addicted. If you scroll social media and you see something you really like, dopamine hit. Sure, there's an increase in dopamine. But then you get to something else and you go, not that interesting. However, had you arrived at that second thing first, you might think that it was really interesting. If you had arrived to that second Instagram post 3 days later or 4 days later, you might find it extremely interesting. Again, how much dopamine you experience from something depends on your baseline level of dopamine when you arrive there and your previous dopamine peaks.
Now, if we move on from the overstimulation side of things a little bit, social media has other negative effects on our psychology. Most social media platforms provide anonymity. Even if people use their real names and even locations, that often doesn't stop them from being toxic online either. When people are sitting behind their computers or their phone screens, it gives a feeling of security to sometimes say more than is needed. You also don't really feel the empathy when you're seeing just an avatar online that you would if you saw someone in person. This generally leads to a much more toxic environment. Now, it would be wonderful if people were able to take constructive criticism or engage in civil conversations, but I think if you spent 5 seconds on the internet, you know that's not really possible. Now, speaking of other negative social effects of social media, another one would be comparison. We often forget that most of what we see on social media doesn't reflect reality. Fake angles, fake captions, fake fame, and fake happiness are all more prevalent on social media, especially nowadays with AI. Now, I'll never forget, I was sitting on a beach in Australia. Now, this is one of the most beautiful beaches in the world, and I happened to be on my phone for a minute. Now, I was on Instagram and I saw a picture of my friend who was in Rome, in Italy. And I remember looking up and thinking like, damn, I wish I was in Rome. Now, I paused for a second, I looked up and I saw this, like I was on one of the most beautiful beaches in Australia. And I just thought like I was such a dick because here I am in one of the most beautiful beaches in Australia. And I'm thinking, I wish I was somewhere else. I wish I was in Rome. And the grand irony of it all was that I bet that friend saw my picture of the beach in Australia and was like, damn, I wish I was on the beach in Australia instead of being at the Colosseum. And I think that's such a great example for me in my life of how just social media and the comparison really does affect us. So when you're on social media, you scroll and you see these people having fun, going to parties, living their best lives, while you overstimulated and suffering from information overload, feel horrible, become jealous, and in many ways almost obsessed. The reality is that most of the people you see are not as happy as they appear to be. You're seeing a highlight reel. You're not seeing the hard times they're going through. This all gets worse with filters and AI photos, and really the worst is yet to come. All of this ends up tricking your brain into thinking that you were doing something wrong with your life and that you should try to achieve these things that other people have. And if you actually try to do that, you find that it's not the way it appears on social media. And this definitely affects your mental health in negative ways. Now, just imagine being a teenager, someone whose brain is still developing compared to being an adult. Now, if you have a problem with or an addiction to social media, most of us do, so that's not really surprising. But the question becomes, what are you going to do about it? The first method to fix a social media addiction is to either quit or limit it severely. Identify the different platforms that are causing issues for you and really look at whether or not you need to continue on them. Sometimes it can be a great relief to just remove yourself from something causing issues in your life. Just like with video games, you need to figure out what your relationship is like with social media. Now, there can be some positives for social media, like connecting with friends, being able to stay in touch with people all over the world. And personally, I enjoy seeing friends of mine who now have kids and being able to see their lives be able to grow. But that doesn't mean I need to stay on top of the news or politics or engage in debates online with strangers on the internet. So I really separate myself from those environments, and I really just use social media much more as a way to either broadcast my message or to stay in touch with close friends that I want to stay in touch with. So use social media as a tool and not as a source of entertainment. Be careful with TikTok videos, YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels. Be aware of how much time you're spending on Discord or Reddit, especially with memes and just Snapchat streaks and all these different things, which ultimately provide you with a lot of entertainment and you get it instantly with easy access, but it can also be affecting your mental health. Instead, use social media as a tool that enhances your life and provides value instead of makes you negative, toxic, and overall affects your life in a negative way. This also goes for platforms that you tend to check impulsively. So logging out of your social media accounts can be a good tactic to help you with this, because when you're standing in line at the bank and you have this impulse to just check social media, that couple moments where you have to actually log into your accounts can cause you to kind of take a pause, step back, and realize maybe you can stand in line at the bank and survive without needing to overstimulate yourself in that moment. Now, social media is just one way that your brain is being affected, but if you want to know another way, then check out this video on what gaming does to the brain.